International developments, the trade war, the 14th of April. Some news. China has halted the export of some rare earth minerals as a response to the ongoing trade war with the USA. The export will require a license, but so far no system is in place for such licenses. The Swedish currency is growing stronger against the US dollar. The Swedish Prime Minister has stated that as US tariffs are in place, that opens up for new trade deals. He brought forward a trade deal with India and Thailand would be two examples. Meanwhile, China, Japan and South Korea has held a meeting regarding free trade in that region. All those countries are expected to be hit hard by the US tariffs. The US has announced that semiconductors from China might also be hit by tariffs, but to what degree is at this time uncertain. Meanwhile, Canada has put several defense programs under review. The most visible one is the F-35 procurement, but other programs are also under review. The EU has announced a rearmament program that could be as big as 800 billion euros. A 150 billion euro program is to be launched if accepted, aimed at improving military capabilities and the European defense industry. That money will probably exclude US companies. In 2022, about 73% of EU procurement for defense went outside the EU, and of that 61% went to US companies. IISS estimate that between 2022 and 2024, the procurement of US weapons from Europe were in the range of $61 billion. Sweden is expected to reach 3.5% of BNP on defense by 2030. It is expected that Sweden will borrow 30 billion euros to quickly expand its military capabilities. Analysis. The USA is quickly losing soft power, and by soft power I mean intangible things that still produces trade. As the US administration has gone on the offensive in trade and defense and attacking former allies, that will have a significant impact for both trade and defense. If we start with defense. In reality, Europe has spent way too little on defense, but that is changing as we speak. The problem for the USA is that by alienating Europe, they are at the same time removing a potential customer. European defense spending will play a huge part in the coming years. If we see up to 800 billion euros over time, and US previously had around 51% of that market, they are risking losing out on over 400 billion euros. And that is no longer really a risk, but I would assess it is a reality. EU has no intention of spending money on US hardware when the US is not only stepping away from Europe, but appears to be actively antagonistic against the continent. J.D. Vance's speech in Munich and its implications can likely not be overstated. It really was an amateur on the world stage, in my opinion. So Europe is now in the position of increasing its defense budget. EU will want to spend that money within the Union. We also have the problem of having US weapons and the control that gives to the USA over European security. That is part of the soft power that the USA is losing out on. We have other examples like Canada now actively reviewing some of their defense programs for similar reasons. USA has made the mistake to think they cannot be replaced, and they can. It will not be easy, rather it will be very difficult, and not all procurement from Europe to the USA will simply stop. But in the long term, they will feel the lack of this. The same is likely to be true for Canada for the same reason. This time it was President Trump calling it the 51st state, or referring to the Prime Minister as the governor. I think we can expect a divergence between US and European defense over the coming decades. Europe will need at least 5 years before European production will start making up some of the difference as compared to US systems, and likely at least over 10 years before Europe is approaching to replace US systems like logistics and intelligence capabilities. Now that is started, and when it comes to security, one cannot simply change the direction all the time. Trump has introduced insecurity, and he might think that will only have a short-term impact, but in my assessment, this will have a very long-term impact. For the USA, they will likely see the need for diminished commitments worldwide, but they will also see a diminished weapons export, especially to Europe. Finding allies when they need them will likely also be harder. Now let's look at trade. The USA is by far the biggest market, and we will see some negotiations to avoid too high tariffs from many countries. But again, while the US market is huge, it is not irreplaceable. A lot of US soft power has fueled US trade, and cheap imports have seen the US economy grow. That has made the US the market that many countries do not want to lose out on. US trade is about 15% of the global trade, and the US GDP is about 26% of the global GDP, just so we have some figures. Tariffs will decrease trade, which will make the US a less attractive market. It will always be an attractive market up to a point, but how much depends on what profit margins can be made. US production, if it can only survive on the tariff advantage, will struggle to be competitive on the world market. In certain sectors, I expect they can compete, but overall, I do not expect that to be the case. Right now, the world is trying to soften the blow from US tariffs, and at the same time find alternative countries to open up free trade agreements with. About 75% of the world's GDP is outside the US and 85% of the trade. So we will see new constellations forming that excludes the USA to some degree. To what degree, of course, depends on what direction Trump will take. In the long term, I expect additional trade deals being struck to keep free trade going. That is, if we look over the coming 2 to 5 years. It takes quite some time to strike a new trade deal, but considering the volatility right now, it is not impossible that time can be reduced. USA has several problems in their trade war with China. One of Trump's goals are likely a tax cut. To be able to fund that, he needs revenues, and a dollar that is not too strong, but not so weak it is put into question. China is sitting on a substantial amount of US Treasury bonds, and Japan holds even more of them, and we are seeing some movement in those. Right now, US government Treasury bonds are somewhat put into question, and China has been reducing their holdings. Should that remain, borrowing for USA will become more expensive, and so may affect the room Trump has for a tax cut. That could be an incentive for Trump to get out of this trade war. However, China is not backing down, and their meeting with Japan and South Korea is, in my opinion, sending a really strong signal. I also expect to see the EU and China meeting at some point. Trump is now really in a corner where it is difficult to back down, and China, which has no term in office, could play this out for the duration. It would for sure hurt their economy extremely much, but they are a dictatorship, so they can think in terms of decades. Trump, meanwhile, likely has until the midterm elections. Should the economy be poor and the inflation high, the Republican Party will likely be in trouble. Then the question is if they can retain the majority in the Congress and Senate. My guess would be that they will lose the majority in at least one of them, either the Congress or the Senate. And a fair bet is that they would lose majority in both. Why is this? It takes decades to move a factory and get it up and running, and fix all the startup problems that will occur. Until that is done, we can expect significantly lower growth in the USA. And the midterm elections are only 2 years away. The EU, Canada and Japan will take a softer approach than China, but in the long term they will either hit back or diverge away from US trade. Likely they will try to do both. Politically, it's hard to see any other outcome. The EU has a trade deficit in services with the US, but a trade surplus in goods. So what could the EU do if they wanted to retaliate? The anti-coercion instrument, called the EU bazooka, is the nuclear option regarding trade. It is conceived as a deterrent from escalation. That tool would allow the EU, among other things, to add tariffs. They can stop selling digital services. They can restrict trade in services. And it can impact access for foreign direct investments and public procurement. Import of US services in 2023 was worth about 400 billion euros. So the EU, if it wants, have a very powerful tool. It is unlikely to be used directly, but US services would likely be a sector targeted if the US-EU trade war would escalate. If it does, we will all grow poorer, and that is not something I would advocate for. But neither can the EU stand still and do nothing. I think there is a fair chance that the US and China will at some point sit down and try to work something out, maybe creating the spheres of influence both countries are now after. If that happens, what will Europe do? The answer is I do not know. So what do I expect from 2025 into 2026? I think we will see countries negotiating with the US to avoid the direct impact the tariffs will have, or at least reduce the impact. I also think they will start trying to diversify away from the US market. I expect a lower growth and that inflation will be on the rise. That is likely to hit US consumers more, simply because they have the tariffs. But I expect inflation in general to be higher. We can expect the oil price to continue decreasing, and usually that could have a positive impact on growth, but I'm not so sure that will be the case if we are in a trade war. I'm pretty sure that US soft power will decrease, and there will be some impact for US brands. There are hardly any brands that cannot be replaced with regional brands. We are seeing already some of that, and I expect that will continue. Maybe not in the form of outright boycotts, even if that is possible, but simply people choosing other brands that are local, like Canadian or European brands. This is an aspect we should not fail to consider, as I think it could have a major impact. What Trump or J.D. Vance will state will have a direct impact on that has nothing to do with politics and all to do with consumers. Europe will be hit pretty hard by this trade war, and China even more so. which is why I expect new trade deals to come into effect much quicker than we usually would see. We are already seeing the beginning of this. US arms exports, especially to Europe, will decrease, or at least it will be a smaller part of the new European rearmament program. The reason, in part, is the US negotiations with Russia, excluding Ukraine and Europe. That has been a strategic mistake. I think Trump now has a problem backing down from China, and China does not seem inclined to do it either at this moment. I still think there is a fair chance they will back down during 2025-26. If they do, it is more likely in 2025, but that is by no means certain. I also think there is a fair chance of stagflation in the US, meaning stagnation in growth, high inflation, and higher unemployment. There is a chance of that in Europe also, but I would assess stagflation as a whole as being less likely in Europe. Most research and most experts would seem to indicate that, but of course it cannot be excluded. Russia is now in a problematic situation. They do not want to give up their maximalistic goals. While negotiating with the US seemed to be a path for them to come in from the cold, the oil price dropping like a stone will directly hit their economy, and they can likely not stall Trump indefinitely. Should the trade war continue, other aspects of the Russian export economy will also be affected. Now, this will likely have no short-term or medium-term impact on the war directly, but it will definitely have a long-term impact if we look into 2026. Militarily, other factors will likely play a bigger part, with the problem of supplying Russian forces with hardware and continue getting people to sign up even though they are having such high losses. The US administration has made several mistakes using a bullying tactic to try and push through their agenda. The problem is, while that can work among companies, it does not really work with countries or large trading blocs. It can appear like that in the short term, but in the long term, this is a major mistake. I expect US domestic pressure will increase on the current administration. What really could affect Trump, I think, is the US oligarchy, which is led by the most wealthy people. I rather suspect they have somewhat more influence on Trump than the man or woman on the street, but how far that influence goes, that is impossible to say. Only time will tell. This is the current assessment I have made. I rather expect ongoing news to come in over the coming weeks that will update this assessment to some degree, one way or another.